What if I told you that the greatest story ever told has a chapter you've never read? A secret epilogue hidden from sight, locked away from the faithful and the curious alike. Let's start with a question, a simple one, but one with the power to unravel everything you think you know. What if Jesus had children? What if his bloodline didn't end at the cross, but was instead carried in secret across vast oceans of time? A sacred inheritance protected by kings who ruled in shadow, concealed by knights who swore silent oaths and hunted relentlessly by popes who feared its very existence. And what if the most sought-after relic in all of Christendom, the Holy Grail, was never a cup at all? What if it was something far more precious, more fragile? A living, breathing lineage, one that still exists today. You've heard the whispers, haven't you? You've seen the fragments in novels and films. Dan Brown, Da Vinci, the Templars. These are the breadcrumbs left for us on the forest floor of history. But beneath the comfortable layers of fiction lies something older and far, far stranger. A royal family methodically erased from history. A divine mandate, a promise written not in ink on fragile parchment, but in the very blood that flows through veins. And now, after so many centuries of silence, the story is beginning to whisper again. But to hear it, to really hear it, you have to slow down with me. Let the noise of the modern world fall away. Let the centuries peel back like the pages of a forgotten book. Let the myths that have been shouted for millennia finally fall silent, so we can hear the truth that was only ever whispered. Let your breath match the rhythm of old stone halls where forgotten kings once walked, and secrets were sealed with dying breaths. Because this isn't just another story. This is a revelation, a single thread that once pulled unravels the grand tapestries of empires, churches, and even the tombs of the dead. It's a journey into a mystery older than kings, deeper than dogma, and sharper than any sword ever raised in its defense. And it begins, as so many secrets do, with a death. Music swells slightly and then fades, leaving a lingering, questioning silence, so dim the lights. Let your curiosity stretch its legs and allow your doubts to nap in the corner for a little while. The first door to this labyrinth is about to open. What secrets do you think are buried the deepest? Share your thoughts below. And if you're ready to continue this journey, follow along as we step into the shadows. It begins, as so many secrets do, with a death. But this was no ordinary death, and he was no ordinary king. Picture it now, if you will. Let your mind drift back through the centuries, past the noise of cities and the glare of electric lights. You find yourself in deep forest, a pale mist rising from damp leaves, the air heavy with the scent of pine and an unnerving silence. The year is 679. A chill creeps across the woods of the Ardennes. The birds have gone quiet. Somewhere along the remnants of an old Roman road, a hunting party moves with an uneasy quiet. Among them rides Dagobert II, King of Austrasia, one of the last great Frankish kingdoms. He is wrapped in a heavy cloak of royal blue, the color of twilight and authority. His face is lined with the burdens of his station, but his eyes burn bright with something that doesn't quite belong in these haunted woods. Something like purpose. It would be the last journey he ever made. History tells us precious little of the moments before his death. One account claims he was deliberately isolated from his loyal guard. Another whispers that he was betrayed by a trusted servant. A hand he had perhaps fed now turned against him. Was it a spear to the eye, a brutal, symbolic blinding, or was it a knife to the throat, silencing whatever words he might have spoken? No chronicler agrees on the details. The truth, it seems, was shrouded from the very beginning. But what they do agree on is this: the king was murdered. And with his death, something sacred was shattered. He was the last obstacle. And once he fell, the door swung open to a new age of rulers, ones more compliant, more useful to the rising powers in Rome, and most importantly, ones without divine blood. What followed his murder was even stranger than the act itself. It was the silence. An unnatural, deafening silence that settled over the records of Europe. The chroniclers, the keepers of history, simply stopped writing. Not just about Dagobert's death, but about the entire royal line he came from. It was as if the ink in every monastery in Christendom froze in mid-air, and the royal blood that spilled quietly onto the forest floor was left unremembered, unremarked upon. Think about that for a moment. Monarchs don't just vanish without consequence. Their deaths spark wars, shift alliances, cause outrage that echoes for generations. Unless someone powerful wanted him gone and wanted him forgotten. This is where the mystery deepens, where the story begins to feel less like history and more like a conspiracy. You see, Dagobert wasn't some failed monarch or a rebel king. On the contrary, he had only recently returned from a long exile in Ireland, where he had lived under the protection and guidance of the church itself. He was restored to his throne with the blessing of bishops and nobles alike, which tells us he had powerful allies. Yet just a few short years later, he was gone. Assassinated under the most mysterious of circumstances, with almost no recorded outrage from the very powers that had supported him. Doesn't that raise your eyebrows? It should. And what of his heir? History tells us that Dagobert had a son, Sigisbert IV, who was, by all accounts, a legitimate heir to the throne. So why did he never rule? There was no crowning, no ceremony, no recorded resistance. Nothing. His name simply slipped from the annals of official history like a stone tossed into a deep, dark well, the ripples vanishing as if they had never been. Where did he go? The whispers, those persistent stories that refuse to die, tell different tales. Some say he fled south to the region we now call the Languedoc, a land of heresy and secrets. Others claim he was hidden away by monks still loyal to the Merovingian cause, and a few bolder voices, the kind often laughed off by serious historians, claim he was taken to a small secluded village in the Pyrenees, where he lived under a new name, and where his descendants still walk today. It all smells like a cover-up, doesn't it? If you're feeling that gentle tingle down your spine, that sense that a piece of the puzzle is deliberately missing, you're not alone. Because Dagobert II wasn't just a king. He was the last of a very specific kind of king. To understand why his death mattered so much, why his memory had to be so thoroughly erased, you have to understand what his family, the Merovingians, believed about themselves. Unlike most royal dynasties who leaned on military might or the divine right granted to them by a pope's blessing, the Merovingians saw themselves as sacred by birth. Their authority didn't come from Rome. They believed it came from the heavens themselves. This wasn't just political posturing. It was baked into the very bones of their rule. And for the burgeoning Christian church, a king who didn't need their stamp of approval was a dangerous thing. He was especially dangerous if he whispered of an ancient bloodline, one stretching back, not just to the kings of Israel, but further still, back to Galilee, back to that quiet fisherman's son who died on a Roman cross and may, just may, have left behind more than just his teachings. Of course, mainstream history scoffs at such a suggestion. There is no academic consensus that Jesus had children. The canonical Gospels are silent on the matter. Any hint of it is quickly branded as speculative or worse, heretical. But history is a stubborn thing, and some stories refuse to be buried. Fringe documents, the Gnostic Gospels, and persistent oral traditions have always lingered in the shadows. The Gospel of Philip, for instance, speaks curiously of Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene, calling her his companion, a term whose Greek roots can imply a spouse, a partner. The interpretations vary. The scholars argue, and certainty slips like water through our fingers. But the idea persisted, especially in pockets of Europe where the church's grip was weaker. And if the Merovingian kings truly believed this, if they saw themselves as the descendants of that sacred union, then you can see how the church, desperate to assert its absolute authority, might view them as an existential threat. Dagobert's assassination, then, wasn't just a political murder, it was theological. A crime committed not just to seize a throne, but to suppress a legacy. One of the strangest clues supporting this view comes not from an ancient scroll, but from a 20th century document filed quietly in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Known as the Dossier Secrets, this modern text claims that Dagobert's line did in fact continue in secret, protected by a society known as the Priory of Sion. Many believe the document is an elaborate hoax, and yet its inclusion of obscure medieval details has puzzled even its staunchest critics. And most curiously, the dossier appeared long before books like the Da Vinci Code popularized these ideas. Someone was whispering this story long before it became a global phenomenon. It all raises a question that still floats unanswered above the forest floor where Dagobert fell. If there was nothing to hide, why was so much effort put into erasing him, not just politically, but spiritually, symbolically, genealogically? The silence surrounding Dagobert's end doesn't feel like a simple historical footnote. It feels like a redacted paragraph, a space on the page where something holy or something dangerous once stood. And that silence has echoes. It echoes in the name of his forgotten son. It echoes in the claims of his divine blood. And it leads us directly to the world his ancestors built a kingdom, not just of land, but of legend. What kind of kings were they, these Merovingians, to inspire such fear and secrecy? What was it about them that had to be buried so deep? Let me know what you think, and join me next time as we step into their world. Last time, we stood at the edge of a dark wood, haunted by the ghost of a murdered king. His name was Dagobert II, and his death was a doorway. Now, I invite you to step through it with me. You stand now in a shadowed hall of memory, a place that smells of incense and iron, where the light is always slightly dimmed by something ancient. The floor beneath your feet is cold stone, and the very air carries the hushed, heavy reverence of an old cathedral. At the far end of this hall sits a throne. It is not gilded, but carved from a dark, gnarled wood, tangled with images of serpents, bees, and curling vines. And there is no crown upon it, only a single lock of long golden hair. Welcome to the world of the Merovingians, kings not just of land, but of legend. They weren't like the other rulers who clawed their way to power in the chaotic centuries after Rome's fall. From the 5th to the 8th century, the Merovingian dynasty ruled over vast swaths of what we now call France and Western Europe. But they were known by a more poetic title, the Rex Crinitus, the long-haired kings. And this wasn't a fashion statement, it was spiritual law. A Merovingian ruler was never ever to cut his hair. It was said to house their sacred power, their divine sanction to rule. To shear a Merovingian king was to strip him of his very essence, to render him powerless, no longer holy. It was a profound act of political heresy, like yanking out the very soul of the state with a pair of scissors. But why this obsession with hair? This wasn't a superstition born from vanity. The tradition most likely grew from deep pre-Christian roots, Druidic and pagan beliefs that were woven together with the threads of early mystical Christianity. In many ways, the Merovingians were syncretic rulers fusing the old gods and the new gospel into something unique and powerful. Their kings were said to possess prophetic dreams, to be born under celestial signs, to heal the sick with a simple touch, all echoes of both ancient Celtic seers and biblical figures. Their people didn't just fear them. In many ways, they venerated them as semi-divine. One of their earliest and most famous kings, Clovis the Fifth, gives us a glimpse into this strange duality. In the year 496, he converted to Roman Christianity. His baptism at Rheims is legendary. A dove was said to have descended from heaven itself, carrying a vial of holy oil for his anointing. It's a dramatic story, but more than a miracle. This marked a quiet submission, a shifting of loyalties from the old gods of Gaul to the rising power of the Latin Church. Still, even under this new Christian veneer, strange things bubbled just beneath the surface. According to later legends, Clovis's own lineage was not entirely of this world. His supposed ancestor Merovec, the man for whom the dynasty is named, was said to have been born of a sea creature. Some tales describe it as a quinotaur, a bull-headed sea beast of myth. Now, this sounds absurd to our modern ears, but remember, ancient symbolism often wrapped deeper truths in mythological skins. Merovec's oceanic origin might have been a way of signifying an otherworldly bloodline, something ancient, pure, and deliberately set apart from the ordinary line of mortals. It was this potent blend of myth and history that gave the Merovingians their true power. Their rule was mystical, bound to the land and its people through something deeper than politics or armies. Their kings were living relics, sacred symbols, which makes their eventual quiet erasure from history even more suspicious. Because here is the strange historical fact. By the time our murdered king, Dagobert II, died, the Merovingian line had already lost most of its direct political power. They were still kings in name, but the real authority lay with the mayors of the palace, chief officials who ran the administration, the finances, and the armies. They were the prototypes, the smiling bureaucrats working quietly behind the curtain. And most notably, the line of mayors included one Pepin of Herstal, whose descendant Pepin the Short would eventually seize the crown and start the next great dynasty, the Carolingians. This transition was not a bloody coup. There was no grand war. It was a slow fade, a bureaucratic whisper campaign. The Merovingians were gradually rendered symbolic figureheads, and when their usefulness had finally expired, they were quietly retired. They were sent to monasteries. Their sacred hair was cut. Their titles were revoked, and their bloodline was diluted into nothing more than a forgotten branch on the royal family tree. But here is the question that lingers like candle smoke in a sealed room. Why all the ceremonial effort to disempower them without destroying them? If the Merovingians had become so irrelevant, why not simply execute them? Why not banish them violently? Why this strange ritual of tucking them away into quiet cloisters, slowly erasing their memory, while allowing the family itself to remain, at least in name? The answer might lie in fear, or reverence, or something stranger still. Believe the Church saw the Merovingians not merely as obsolete rulers, but as rivals to Christ himself. Think about it. If the Merovingians truly believed themselves descended from Jesus through Mary Magdalene, then their claim to power would threaten not just earthly kingship, but the very doctrine of the Church. Christianity's foundation hinges on the idea of divine sacrifice, not divine succession. A Jesus who left behind a family, a lineage, is a Jesus grounded in blood and flesh, not solely in spirit. That would make the Merovingian kings living heresy. And heresy is far more dangerous when it walks talks and claims a throne. When Dagobert II died in that forest, the curtain didn't just fall on a man, it fell on a mystery. The silence that followed wasn't just political, it was mythic, and you can still feel it if you try. Walk through the ancient woods of the Ardennes. Listen to the hush that follows your footsteps. Somewhere in the soil beneath layers of forgotten kings and moss-covered crypts, the story is still breathing, waiting to be told. But where did this incredible claim of divine blood come from? Was it a calculated political myth? Or was it rooted in a secret journey that began centuries earlier on the shores of Galilee? Next time, we will trace that sacred thread back to its very beginning. What kind of power did the Merovingian kings believe they held? What was the source of this divine blood that set them apart, that made them so revered and ultimately so dangerous? To answer that, we must follow a thread thin as silk, yet strong as fate, stretching from the sun-drenched hills of Galilee to the misty forests of ancient Gaul. It winds through deserts and catacombs, through cloisters and coronations. It passes through wombs, through whispers, and through wars. And at every point along its length, someone has tried to cut it. But the thread remains pulsing softly beneath the very skin of history. This is where the story becomes its most controversial, its most profound. So, I ask you to listen with an open mind. The foundational claim is this, that Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene were not only close companions, but husband and wife, that they had children, and that after the crucifixion, those children were exiled or hidden, eventually settling in the wild, remote lands of what is now southern France. Now, this idea, of course, exists far outside mainstream Christian teaching. But it is not a new invention, not a modern fantasy. In fact, you can find fragments of it in early Gnostic texts, in the persistent oral traditions of the French Languedoc, and most provocatively in the pages of the Gospel of Philip. This is a manuscript discovered buried in the Egyptian sand that refers to Mary Magdalene as Jesus's koinonos, a Greek term far richer than the bland translation of companion. In ancient Greek, koinonos carries deep undertones of partnership, of intimacy, even of marriage. Modern scholars debate its meaning endlessly. Was it metaphorical? Was it literal? Or just a linguistic artifact of a forgotten time? No one agrees. Which means the door, however, inconveniently remains ajar. So let's just, for the sake of our journey, assume this bloodline existed. What happened to it? How did it survive? The legend, especially strong in the region of Provence, tells of Mary Magdalene fleeing after the crucifixion, taking her unborn child with her. The stories say she arrived by boat, a boat without sails or rudder, guided only by providence, with a small group that may have included Lazarus and Martha. She landed in the region of Sainte Marie de la Mer, a place that still venerates her to this day. You can go there now and see shrines bearing her name, statues depicting her with flowing red hair and holding a golden vessel. A vessel often mistaken for the Grail cup, but which may symbolize something far more organic, something inherited. According to this version of history, her child or children form the foundation of a new sacred bloodline. It was carefully protected, quietly multiplied, and eventually, through strategic marriages, it merged with the local Frankish nobility. By the time the Roman Empire was fracturing, and Gaul was a chaotic tapestry of barbarian tribes, that holy blood had allegedly found its way into the lineage of the Merovingians. Enter Clovis, the brilliant and brutal warlord we met earlier, the man who unified the Frankish tribes and converted to Christianity, reshaping Western Europe forever. We spoke of his baptism, but let's look again through this new lens. Unlike other kings of his time, Clovis wasn't just converted. He was anointed with holy oil said to have descended from heaven, brought by a dove in a vial known as the Saint Ampoule. This story, so strange and dramatic, set Clovis apart. It wasn't just an act of faith. It was a ritual of selection, a coronation marked not by human hands, but by divine appointment. But why him? Why this one pagan warlord? The whispers say Clovis was chosen not simply for his military genius or his willingness to bow to Rome, but because he carried something within him, something ancient, a whisper of that sacred thread. If the Merovingians truly descended from the line of Jesus, then Clovis was not merely a king. He was a living bridge between the divine and the temporal, the perfect merger of sword and spirit. Of course, official history records no such link. It tells us Clovis was the son of a pagan Frankish king, Childeric III, and a noblewoman named Basina. Their family tree is mapped out neatly until you begin to notice the gaps, the missing years, the vague maternal links that fade into uncertainty. And then there are the symbols, the golden bees found in his father Childeric's tomb, intricately crafted, lying beside his remains as silent guardians. As we've learned, bees were sacred to the Merovingians, potent symbols of resurrection, eternal life, and royal legitimacy. The claim, then, is this: the bloodline from Jesus and Mary Magdalene did not vanish into legend. It flowed into the Merovingians, was made flesh through Clovis, and continued, however quietly, through their heirs. It was protected, obscured, but never ever extinguished. If true, this is precisely why the idea is so dangerous. Because if this sacred descent is real, it challenges the authority of every church, every doctrine, every monarchy that claims divine right without divine DNA. It shifts the entire conversation from salvation through faith to salvation through blood, from churches to chromosomes. It suggests that the ultimate spiritual authority isn't bestowed in a ceremony, but carried in our very cells. Can it be proven? Most historians scoff. The records simply don't go back that far. DNA evidence is too thin, too untraceable across so many centuries, and yet the clues, the patterns, the recurring names, Dagobert, Sigisbert, Plantard, Rennes le Chateau, keep reappearing like musical notes in a hidden melody playing just beneath the noise of recorded history. Perhaps it was never about proof. Perhaps it was only ever about continuity, about the way a story once whispered finds its way into bone and blood, surviving long after empires fall and saints are forgotten. So I ask you to consider this just for a moment in the quiet of your own thoughts. What would you do if you discovered your family descended not from warlords or peasants, but from a man who walked on water and the woman who stood weeping at the foot of his cross? Would you hide it, protect it, build an entire dynasty around it? Or would you bury it so deep that even history itself wouldn't find it? The answer to that question might lie in how we understand the Grail itself. Is it an object to be found, or is it something else entirely? Join me next time as we redefine the very nature of the quest. The word alone. Grail summons images, doesn't it? A glittering chalice held aloft in a beam of divine sunlight. A knight, pure of heart, kneeling in a misty forest chapel. It is a symbol embedded so deeply in our cultural imagination that we rarely stop to question it. The Grail, we are told, is the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, the sacred vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, an object of untold power, a relic that could heal the world. Except, what if it isn't? What if that entire story, repeated for nearly 1,000 years, is a misunderstanding? A beautiful, poetic, and deliberate misdirection. What if the Holy Grail was never a cup? What if it was a person? This is where we must look closer at the words themselves. In medieval French, the Holy Grail was known as a Saint Grail. But what if the early storytellers had intended a different spacing, a different meaning? What if it was never Saint Grail, but Saint Raal? The shift is subtle, just a single space, but its implication is earth-shattering. Because Saint Raal does not mean Holy Grail, it means royal blood. This isn't just a clever linguistic trick. It is a conceptual rupture, a redirection of centuries of myth. It shifts our focus from an inanimate object to a living inheritance, from a sacred vessel to a sacred lineage. And at the core of this theory is a breathtaking claim that the Grail represents not the cup that held Christ's blood, but the bloodline itself, alive, hidden, and passed down through the generations. If you trace the Grail stories back to their very source, you find something curious. The earliest and most influential writings from the 12th century poet Chrétien de Troyes describe a mysterious procession involving a golden grail, but they offer no explanation of what it is. There is no mention of Christ's cup. It was only later, through authors like Robert de Boron, that the Grail became explicitly linked to Christian relics. And even then, the details are never consistent. Sometimes it's the cup of the Last Supper, Sometimes it catches his blood at the cross. Sometimes it grants immortality. Sometimes healing, sometimes simply spiritual insight. The variability itself is suspicious, isn't it? The Grail never had a single fixed identity. It was a cipher, a powerful symbol just waiting to be filled with meaning. So why not this meaning? Why not a bloodline? Those who subscribe to this theory point out that most Grail quests are not about finding an object, but about understanding its mystery. They are inward journeys. The knight doesn't just stumble upon the Grail. He must be worthy of it. Often only those of pure heart or significantly of noble lineage can even approach it. This suggests the Grail is less an object and more a profound truth, a hidden knowledge encoded into the fabric of dynastic succession. And perhaps most compellingly, the earliest Grail romances were almost all written in the very same regions we've been exploring: southern France, the Languedoc-Occitania, precisely where the legends of Mary Magdalene's exile and the survival of a sacred bloodline also took root. Coincidence? Possibly. But coincidences, like riddles, have a tendency to multiply when you ignore them. Now consider this. In several of these early Grail texts, the Grail bearer is a woman. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's epic Parzival, she is a queen. She doesn't wield a sword or rule a kingdom. Her role is to carry, to preserve. In a few versions of the legend, the Grail bearer is even depicted as being pregnant, a symbolic mother. Could the Grail in these stories be a code? Could the bearer of the Grail be a literary stand-in for the protector of the bloodline, a Magdalene figure hidden in plain sight within the pages of chivalric romance? Suddenly, the Church's long and troubled relationship with Mary Magdalene makes a terrible kind of sense. For centuries, she was slandered, officially rebranded as a repentant prostitute, despite there being absolutely no biblical basis for this claim. Her true role in the resurrection narratives, her clear importance among the disciples, all of it was minimized, distorted, or erased. Why would the early church fathers go to such lengths to diminish a woman so clearly central to Christ's ministry? Unless, of course, she represented something dangerous. Not just spiritual insight, but blood. Not just devotion, but lineage. To reinterpret the Grail as Mary Magdalene, or more precisely, as the sacred womb that carried Christ's child, is not only consistent with ancient symbology, it unlocks layers of meaning in the myth. The quest for the Grail becomes something far more intimate, more heretical. It's not a hunt for a relic. It's a search for origin, for continuity, for the truth of one's inheritance. And if the Grail is a bloodline, it can't truly be lost and found in a vault or a hidden chapel. It lives in people, in families, in descendants. This explains why so many Grail tales end not with a triumphant discovery, but with an ambiguous departure. The Grail is revealed only to vanish again, as if to say, "You cannot possess this. You must be born from it." And perhaps most chilling of all, if the church knew this, they had every reason to bury the truth. A relic can be enshrined, a doctrine can be debated, but a bloodline, a living human being who embodies a truth that undermines the entire theological structure of divine mystery, that's not a theological inconvenience. That's a revolution waiting to happen. If a truth this explosive existed, wouldn't it require guardians? A secret brotherhood sworn to protect, not a cup, but a lineage that stretches back through the ages. Join me next time as we investigate the Priory of Sion and the secret dossiers that claim to hold the key. If a truth as explosive as a sacred bloodline existed, if a lineage carrying the very DNA of Jesus Christ survived the centuries, surely it would have required guardians. A secret brotherhood operating in the shadows, sworn to protect not a cup, but a living, breathing legacy. Our journey now takes us from ancient legends to the modern world, to a place of quiet scholarship and carefully filed papers. Imagine a dim reading room in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. The air is still smelling of old paper and mahogany, quiet enough to hear the gentle scratch of a fountain pen across a page. Into this room in 1975, a man named Pierre Plantard walks and files a strange set of documents under an even stranger name, the Dossier Secrets. On their own, these papers seem eccentric, perhaps the work of a fantasist. They contain tangled genealogical charts, obscure correspondences, and lists of the supposed grand masters of a secret society called the Priory of Sion. But within their pages lies the spark that would ignite the modern Grail mythos and change how we view European history forever. These dossiers, these archival ghosts planted without context, claimed something extraordinary, that the Merovingian bloodline had not died out with the last of its kings. It had simply gone underground. According to these pages, Dagobert's son, Sigisbert, had escaped the assassination that claimed his father and had taken refuge in the Languedoc region of southern France. From there, his descendants continued in absolute secrecy, protected by an ancient brotherhood sworn to preserve the sacred bloodline of Christ. It is a bold, almost unbelievable claim, and yet buried within the flamboyant storytelling was something quietly unsettling. There were details too precise, too obscure to be dismissed outright. Ancient family trees listed little-known nobles, their titles and lands meticulously cross-referenced. There were diagrams of seals resembling early Merovingian symbology. The documents even referenced real, verifiable historical figures like Bertrand de Blanchefort, a Grand Master of the Knights Templar, suddenly reinterpreted as a guardian of this secret, not just a warrior of the cross. The Priory of Sion, the documents claimed, had existed since at least the 11th century. It was not merely a religious order, but the shadow hand guiding major European events, its sole mission the protection of a bloodline so powerful it threatened the very structure of church and empire. Their mission was to preserve the Grail, not the San Grail, the chalice, but the Sang Raal, the royal blood. At this point, you might feel the tug of skepticism tighten just behind your eyes. And that's fair enough. After all, Pierre Plantard, the man who deposited the documents, was later exposed for embellishment, even outright invention. But this is where the story takes another twist. Although parts of the dossier were fabricated, not all of it was false. Some of the obscure genealogies they contained have since been verified by independent researchers. Some of the tombs, referenced only in these strange documents, were found in the real world, right where the papers described them to be. Then there is the list of supposed Grand Masters, a list that includes names like Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo. It's a roster so absurdly high profile that it either screams hoax or perhaps a deliberate and brilliant distraction. There is also the problem of timing. The dossiers appeared in the 1970s before the Grail craze exploded into popular culture. This was long before the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, long before Dan Brown, long before whispered tours of Rosslyn Chapel. So, if this was merely a hoax, it was an astonishingly prescient one. Under oath, in a French court, Plantard even claimed to be a direct descendant of the Merovingians himself. While that part of his story didn't hold up under legal scrutiny, the court's reaction was curious. He wasn't prosecuted for fraud. The entire matter was dropped quietly without any further public inquiry. Why? Perhaps the real question isn't just whether the Priory of Sion exists, but whether it ever needed to. Throughout history, noble families have preserved their lineages with obsessive care through strategic marriages and hidden heirs. What is unusual here is the immense religious weight attached to the Merovingian bloodline. If the Church believed these claims even slightly, the political risk would have been staggering. A living bloodline claiming direct descent from Jesus would completely undermine centuries of papal authority. The Church would no longer be the sole mediator between God and man, because that mediator would be walking, breathing, and perhaps even ruling among them. The dossiers also mention something chilling: a vault hidden somewhere beneath the Pyrenees, allegedly holding the complete Merovingian genealogy, along with sacred artifacts perhaps even the bones of Mary Magdalene herself. Again, there is no proof, just an idea. But this idea has been enough to spur generations of treasure hunters, scholars, and secret societies into a state of quiet obsession. Perhaps the dossier's secrets were never meant to be taken as literal proof. Perhaps they were a smoke signal, an invitation sent out into the world for us to look again at the cracks in the cathedral walls, at the absences in the royal registers, at the names spoken in dreams, but not in records. After all, secrets rarely shout. They whisper, sometimes in ancient parchment, sometimes through missing tombs, and sometimes, most unsettlingly, in plain sight. The dossiers mentioned a Templar Grand Master as a guardian. But what was the true purpose of the Knights Templar? Were they merely soldiers of the faith? Or were they the first and most powerful guardians of this world-shattering secret? Join me next time as we enter their mysterious world of ritual power and sacrifice. Picture a weathered fortress at dawn, its ancient turrets wrapped in the silence of morning mist. Beneath its cold stone vaults, a group of knights kneels in prayer, their white mantles marked by a simple, stark red cross, their swords laid upon the altar like sacred relics. This is not merely a military order preparing for battle. It is a ritual in motion, a mystery encoded in discipline and obedience. And at the heart of it, if the whispers of history are to be believed, is a secret older than any sword, more potent than any oath, the bloodline they may have sworn to protect. They are the Knights Templar warrior monks of the Holy Land, founders of Europe's first international banking network, and for nearly 2 centuries, one of the most powerful and enigmatic forces in Christendom. Their rise was meteoric. Popes blessed them and kings feared them. The official version of their story tells us they protected pilgrims and fought as the shock troops of Christian orthodoxy. But there are other accounts, ones often dismissed as fringe, that tell a deeper, stranger tale. A story that connects the Templars not just to Jerusalem, but to something buried deep beneath it. Shortly after their formation, the Templars established their headquarters on the Temple Mount in a spot tradition holds was built atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. And while they were officially there to protect the holy site, they soon began to do something else. They began digging. Quietly for years, with no recorded purpose and no grand construction projects, they excavated the sacred ground beneath their feet, and then just as quietly they stopped. What were they searching for? What could they possibly have found? Some believe it was the legendary Ark of the Covenant. Others suggest it was a hoard of lost scrolls or ancient sacred relics. But the most persistent and dangerous theory is this: that they found proof of the sacred bloodline, not a metaphor, but tangible evidence, names, dates, genealogies. A buried truth that would irrefutably link Jesus Christ to living descendants and place the Merovingian kings at the very center of a spiritual revolution. Of course, there is no hard academic evidence of what they found, but after their time in Jerusalem, something about the Templars changed. They grew astonishingly wealthy and politically influential. Far beyond their humble mission, they began erecting cathedrals and chapels across Europe, using architectural forms never seen before, steeped in sacred geometry and strange symbolism, circles, pentagrams, and mysterious black madonnas. Their rituals became more opaque, their hierarchy more secretive, their purpose seemingly shifting from protecting pilgrims to guarding a secret of their own. And then came their downfall. It was as swift and brutal as their rise had been miraculous. By the early 1300s, the Templars had become too powerful, and King Philip IV of France, who was heavily indebted to them, turned on the order. On Friday the 13th, 1307, a date that has been ominous ever since his soldiers swept across France, arresting the Templars en masse. They were tortured relentlessly and forced to confess to all manner of heresies, spitting on the cross, engaging in blasphemous rites, and worshiping a strange idol, a disembodied head, sometimes called Baphomet. The charges sound wild, almost too convenient. And yet, under the agony of torture, many knights confessed to something. They spoke of possessing a knowledge too great for men, a truth that the church feared above all else. One even hinted at a bloodline, a line that stretches to the east and yet remains here with us. Were these just the desperate ravings of broken men, or were they fragments of a secret too old, too sacred to name? A curious document the Chinon parchment discovered in the Vatican secret archives only in 2001 adds another layer of mystery. It reveals that Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templar leaders of heresy before their executions. Why absolve them in private and then allow their public destruction? Was it a pang of guilt, or was it fear of what they might reveal if allowed to live? And what of the head they were accused of worshiping? Scholars have argued for centuries about what it might have been: an idol, a preserved relic, a symbol. But the most chilling theory is that it was not a mere object at all, but a relic of the bloodline itself, a literal head, perhaps the mummified remains of someone of immense importance, someone from a lineage too sacred to destroy, but far too dangerous to reveal. This is where we circle back to the Merovingians. The legend claims the Templars' true mission, the very reason for their secrecy and power, was the protection of the descendants of that ancient union between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the sang Raal, the royal blood. Many believe the Templars never truly fell. They simply transferred their mission and their secrets into other groups that would follow: the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, secret societies that inherited not just their symbols, but their sacred duty to guard the bloodline until the world was ready for the truth. But here, we must ask a darker question, one that twists the knife of this mystery even deeper. Secrecy is a double-edged sword. What is hidden can be protected, but it can also be stolen. What if the Templars didn't merely guard the bloodline? What if they used it? What if they appropriated its power, its legitimacy, and its divine symbolism for themselves, while the true descendants were pushed aside, forgotten, cloaked in borrowed divinity? You can almost hear the stone doors closing, the echo of steel boots on a dungeon floor, the rustle of a banner falling into dust. And somewhere, just beneath the crushing silence of history, the heartbeat of a secret still guarded by men who would never speak its name. So, who were they truly? Were the Knights Templar the loyal defenders of a sacred truth? Or were they the cunning stewards of a legacy they claimed but never truly owned? The answer may be lost to the fires of their execution pyres, or perhaps it's waiting for us in a sleepy village in the south of France. Join me next time as we travel to Rennes-le-Château. You find yourself high in the foothills of the Pyrenees, where the wind moves like a whisper between ancient olive trees and crumbling stone. The air here smells of sun-warmed soil and forgotten secrets. Nestled in this quiet corner of southern France is a village so small, so remote, you might miss it entirely on a map. And yet for over a century, it has guarded one of the strangest and most enduring enigmas in modern history. The village is called Rennes-le-Château, and at the heart of its mystery stands a single man, Bérenger Saunière, the 19th century priest who, if the stories are to be believed, stumbled upon something so explosive it threatened the very foundations of the church itself. He was assigned to this forgotten parish in 1885. The chapel dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene was dilapidated, the presbytery where he was to live barely habitable. By all logic, Father Saunière should have lived out his years in quiet obscurity, tending to a handful of peasants and scraping together sermons for a near-empty church. But then something changed. It began with a simple renovation. Saunière started repairing the ancient church, but his repairs were strange. He ordered lavish custom statues, vibrant stained glass windows, and a bizarre altar oddly decorated with figures of demon skulls and cryptic Latin phrases carved into the stone. Inscriptions that read, "By this sign you will conquer." And most unsettlingly, terrible is this place. Curious language for a village chapel, wouldn't you say? And then came the spending. The once impoverished priest suddenly had funds. Not a little, a lot. He built a magnificent tower, which he named the Tour Magdala, the Magdala Tower, to house his personal library. He constructed a lavish estate, the Villa Bethania, and filled it with rare books, priceless antiques and entertained a stream of intriguing guests, scholars, nobles, perhaps even spies. When asked where the money came from, he would simply wave the question away, attributing it to generous donations. But local records tell a different story. There were no large tithes, no wealthy patrons. His immense wealth appeared quite literally from nowhere. The legend, the story that has drawn treasure hunters and mystics here for decades is this: during the renovation of the church, while moving the ancient altar, Saunière found something hidden inside a hollowed-out pillar. A set of parchments sealed in wooden tubes. These parchments were said to contain strange genealogies, references to a hidden bloodline, and messages encrypted with layers of ciphers. Some claimed they explicitly mentioned King Dagobert II and the Priory of Sion. Whether these documents ever truly existed remains a matter of fierce debate, but what did exist was Saunière's sudden and inexplicable access to extraordinary resources. He made frequent trips to Paris, where he was seen consulting with members of the city's occult elite. He visited the Church of Saint-Sulpice, a place known for its deep ties to esoteric Catholicism and strange symbolism. He returned not just with money, but with rare books on alchemy, ancient symbols, and sacred geometry. And perhaps most oddly of all, he spent large sums of money simply purchasing the land around the village for no other reason, it seemed, than to ensure no one else could dig there. His own chapel became a surreal fusion of piety and paranoia. The Stations of the Cross that he commissioned contain bizarre visual anomalies, figures staring directly at the viewer with knowing eyes, inverted Christian symbology, and what appear to be secret hand signs hidden in the gestures of saints and soldiers. Some believe the very layout of the church itself encodes a message, a map, or perhaps a warning, a riddle in marble and wood, meant only for eyes trained to read between the lines. And then, just as suddenly as it began, his fortune seemed to run out. The church launched an official investigation into his finances, threatening him with excommunication. But Saunière refused to reveal the source of his wealth to his superiors. He claimed it came from saying thousands of masses for the dead, a bureaucratic and logistical impossibility. It was the only excuse he ever offered. In his final years, he became reclusive and sullen. And when he suffered a stroke in 1917, the priest who was called to hear his final confession emerged from the room visibly shaken. He allegedly refused to grant Saunière absolution. What, one wonders, did the dying priest confess? Upon his death, his entire estate was inherited by his loyal housekeeper and close companion, Marie Desnarnaud. She lived a long life, refusing all offers to buy the estate, guarding its secrets fiercely. On her own deathbed, she reportedly whispered to a friend, "The secret is so big, people would never believe it. So what haunts the hills of Rennes-le-Château? Was Saunière simply a clever fraud who exploited the church? Or did he truly discover something? Something buried beneath that ancient altar, something that had lain dormant for centuries. Skeptics rightly point to the lack of hard evidence, the absence of the original parchments, the way the story has been exaggerated over time. But they struggle to explain the church's own strange behavior. Why were his crimes never formally prosecuted? Why was the file on him so quickly and quietly closed? Perhaps the secret wasn't his to reveal. Or perhaps he never revealed it at all. Maybe it's still there beneath the stones waiting. It's why people still come here. Not just for the view, but for the feeling you get when you step into that strange little church, that quiet nudge behind your ribs, the sense that the air is holding its breath, that the walls know something, that the Grail was never far away, that it was never a cup, it was a name. But if Saunière was silenced by the church, what exactly were they afraid of? What secrets might be held, not in a small village chapel, but in the most secure archive on earth? Join me next time as we turn our gaze toward Rome and the Vatican's great erasure. Now we step into quieter corridors, places where words vanish and silence is scripted. Imagine the Vatican not as the grand basilica you see on postcards, but as a sprawling, silent labyrinth of filing rooms, sealed drawers and keys known only to a chosen few. Beneath its polished floors and sanctified halls lies one of the most secure and mysterious collections of documents on earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It was once called the Secret Archive, not, they say, because of its secrecy, but from the Latin word secretum, meaning private. Yet it still bears the unmistakable aura of something deliberately carefully hidden. And deep within these temperature-controlled vaults, behind miles of locked glass and silent Latin indexes, some believe the greatest cover-up in human history lies filed neatly away. Not gold, not relics, but records. If the bloodline of Christ did exist, and if the church knew of it, then this is where the evidence would be. The archive is home to more than 50 miles of shelving containing documents that stretch back well over 1,000 years. The trial records of the Knights Templar are here. The papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther is here. The very breath of popes long dead is captured in the ink on this parchment. Yet only a handful of scholars are granted access each year. Requests must be specific, approved in advance, and you are guided, watched, limited. You don't just browse the shelves here. This is a system designed to prevent unexpected revelations, to protect the past from the prying eyes of the present. You see, the church is an expert in managing memory. It doesn't always need to burn books to destroy an idea. Sometimes it simply buries them. It reframes narratives, redirects attention, and allows inconvenient truths to fade into the quiet fog of forgetfulness. The Merovingians, with their inconvenient claims of divine blood and their dangerous proximity to a Christ not entirely controlled by doctrine, were the perfect target for this silent erasure. Let's go back for a moment. As we've discussed, the Merovingians were quietly brushed aside when Pope Zachary sanctioned the rise of Pepin the Short and the Carolingian dynasty in 751. It happened without war or rebellion, suggesting a bargain had been struck in the shadows. The deal theorists' claim was this: the church would grant the Carolingians the crown, and in exchange the Carolingians would help erase the Merovingians' divine claims forever. Their mysticism would be rebranded as paganism, their sacred rituals as superstitions. And most effectively, the church would simply stop talking about them entirely. And this is a well-established historical fact. After the Carolingians came to power, church-approved chronicles largely ceased mentioning the Merovingians at all. There was no formal condemnation, no great debate, just absence. It's as if history quietly inhaled and chose never to exhale their name again. The paper trail of this erasure may lie in the archive. During the Albigensian Crusade in 1244, a set of heretical Cathar documents was seized from their last stronghold at Montségur. These texts, which had been hidden in the Pyrenees for centuries, reportedly included genealogical charts and something referred to cryptically as the linea sacra regalis, the sacred royal line. The documents were taken to the Vatican, where they vanished into the archives. No inventory, no published reference, nothing. Centuries later, in the 1600s, a brilliant Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher made a brief puzzling note in one of his private letters. He described a forbidden manuscript he had seen in the Vatican's possession, sealed in a copper box. He didn't give its title, but referred to it as the Sanguinis Veritatis, the blood of truth. He wrote that it undermines the foundations of dogma with lineage and names too ancient to refute. He never mentioned it again. Was this just a poetic metaphor, or was he describing a real document? Perhaps the very genealogy seized from the Cathars. We must also remember, the Church has redacted history before. It is not just possible, it is precedent. Gospels were excluded from the Bible at the Council of Nicaea. The Inquisition burned entire libraries. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls were initially withheld from the public, for decades controlled by a select group of scholars, many handpicked by the Church. And consider the Gospel of Mary, a Gnostic text discovered in the 19th century that was buried for centuries. It paints Mary Magdalene not as a footnote, but as a teacher, a confidant, the chosen heir to Christ's wisdom, a direct challenge to the authority of Peter, upon which the entire church is built. In 1957, a Vatican librarian named Father Gianni gave a single cryptic public statement. When asked about the missing years of Merovingian records, he replied, "Some truths are not lost. They are withheld to protect what should never be questioned." It was perhaps the most telling silence of all, because erasure doesn't always look like flames. Sometimes it looks like preservation. It looks like reverent silence, like rooms with no windows, like drawers with no labels. And somewhere in the Vatican's endless guarded hush, a box may sit locked and untouched, waiting for no one. But what if the keepers of this secret were cleverer than its suppressors? What if they didn't hide it in vaults, but in plain sight, in the brush strokes of the most famous painting in the world? Join me next time as we seek the code of Leonardo da Vinci. Let your eyes adjust to the warm candlelight of an old studio. Dust glints in the sunbeams that pierce the gloom, and the scent of linseed oil and drying pigments is thick in the air. Canvases, half-finished masterpieces, lean against every surface like silent conspirators. And there, hunched over a large slab of wood, his gaze a focused mixture of divine mischief and mathematical precision, sits Leonardo da Vinci, polymath, inventor, anatomist. And if some theories are to be believed, a secret keeper of the bloodline, we have now reached one of the most famous and most controversial links in this tangled web of history. The idea that Leonardo, perhaps the greatest genius of the Renaissance, embedded secrets about the Merovingian lineage and the holy bloodline directly into his paintings, most famously in The Last Supper. Let's begin with what everyone knows. The painting, created between 1495 and 1498 on the wall of a convent in Milan, depicts Jesus and his 12 apostles. At the precise moment he announces that one of them will betray him. The composition is perfect, balanced, emotional, yet oddly still. But it's not what's there that has triggered centuries of suspicion. It's who is there. Look closely at the figure seated to the right of Jesus, to our left. Traditionally, this is labeled as the young apostle John. But for centuries, artists and scholars alike have noted the figure's unmistakably feminine appearance. The flowing auburn hair, the delicate soft features, the high cheekbones, the tilted head, the complete lack of a beard, and the gentle way the hands are clasped, not in fear, but in serene contemplation. Could this be Mary Magdalene? This question erupted into the mainstream conversation thanks to the Da Vinci Code, but the speculation didn't begin with Dan Brown. For centuries, theorists have noted not only the feminine form, but the V-shaped space created between Jesus and this figure, a shape that forms a distinct symbolic chalice, a grail, if you will. The breathtaking suggestion is that Mary Magdalene is not just present at the Last Supper, she is central to it, not merely beside Jesus, but part of a symbolic union, equal, intimate, essential. Leonardo never labeled his figures, but he also never did anything without profound intent. This was a man obsessed with symmetry, with divine proportion, with sacred geometry. The entire painting pulses with a hidden structure. It is by all accounts a visual code. He was known to write in mirrored script and even embedded musical scales into his paintings. He was not just painting theology, he was encrypting it. Consider another of his masterpieces, The Virgin of the Rocks. There are two versions of this painting, one in the Louvre and one in London. Both depict the Virgin Mary, the infant Jesus, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel set within a symbolic, almost womb-like cave. But there are subtle, unsettling inconsistencies between them. Some see in these two paintings an echo of duality, two versions of the same truth, one overt and one obscured, one for the public and one for those who knew how to see. So what was the truth Leonardo was trying to convey? We know he was closely associated with powerful patrons like the Sforza family, who were known sponsors of esoteric study. We know he illustrated texts that included not just flying machines, but sacred maps and symbols found in early Templar manuscripts. This leads us to the core of the claim that Leonardo da Vinci was not merely a painter for the church, but a custodian of its counter-narrative. The narrative that the Holy Grail was a bloodline, that the church had brutally suppressed the feminine aspect of the divine, that Mary Magdalene, not Peter, was the rightful heir to Christ's teachings, and that her descendants, perhaps the Merovingians, were the living Grail. Of course, this idea infuriates traditional art historians and theologians. They point to the lack of direct primary evidence and the way our brains love to find patterns where none were intended. And these are valid critiques, but we must consider the time in which Leonardo lived. He painted the Last Supper during an era when heresy meant death by fire. He could not have simply stated these ideas outright, but hiding them in plain sight, that is a different matter entirely. And when you remember that his patrons were often the political enemies of Rome, the motivation for such a dangerous act becomes clearer. Was he transmitting a truth he had learned as a member of a secret society? Or was he simply shaping a beautiful narrative of his own? He left behind no personal memoirs and no overt theology to guide us. What he left, instead, was a body of work that glows with questions. A man obsessed with anatomy, who painted hearts into halos, a man who understood blood and perhaps its legacy. So the next time you look at the Last Supper, let your eyes soften. See not a cup, but a space. See not 13 men, but a pair, a symmetry, a secret. And in that negative space between them, where no hand touches, and yet everything connects, you might just find the shape of the Grail. The suppression of one story, that of Mary Magdalene, and its replacement with another, finds a striking parallel in the political realm. The quiet replacement of one royal dynasty with another. Join me next time as we witness the Carolingian coup and the burying of a truth to make way for a new king. Imagine history not as a sequence of events, but as a grand and ancient stage. Curtains rise and fall, costumes change, the actors rotate through their roles. But behind the scenes, in quiet candlelit rooms, the script is constantly being rewritten by men whose names are rarely remembered, only their decisions. And one of the boldest rewrites in European history was the quiet replacement of a mystical dynasty with a manufactured one. The Merovingians erased the Carolingians installed, and a sacred bloodline forcibly traded for a more obedient brand of king. Let us set the scene. The year is 751. The vast Frankish kingdom is large, but it is fraying at the edges. The Merovingian monarch Childeric III sits on the throne, but in name only. His long hair, once the very source of his family's sacred power, is now long but meaningless. The real authority lies with a man named Pepin the Short, the mayor of the palace, a role originally designed simply to manage court affairs, but which has now become more powerful than the king himself. Pepin is a man of action, strategic, charismatic, and importantly, he is well connected to the rising power of the Church in Rome. According to the Frankish annals, Pepin sent envoys to Pope Zachary with a bold and pointed question. Should the one who holds the power of the king also be the king? The Pope, facing his own threats from the Lombards in Italy and in desperate need of a strong military ally, responded with a subtle but revolutionary nod. Yes, the throne should be held by the one who actually rules. The message was clear, and with that papal blessing, Childeric III was deposed. He was not assassinated. He was not exiled in chains. He was simply sent to a monastery. His sacred hair was shorn from his head, and his power was nullified by scissors and by silence. And in his place, Pepin was crowned King of the Franks, anointed not by local bishops, but by a representative of the Pope himself. In that moment, the Carolingian dynasty was born, and with it a powerful new alignment between church and crown. But here is where things become curiously deliberate. The Carolingians didn't just replace the Merovingians, they rewrote them. Church-approved chronicles were redrafted, genealogies were questioned and edited. The Merovingian kings, who had once been praised in earlier texts for their miracles and visions, were suddenly painted as ineffective, lazy, and corrupt, the roi fainéants, or the do-nothing kings. The entire narrative of history shifted as if a stagehand had simply pulled a lever and flipped the backdrop from a scene of divine mystery to one of political convenience. There is a stunning fact buried here, one that's easy to overlook because it feels so mundane. There was no war. There was no civil unrest, no great public outrage. A dynasty that had ruled for nearly 1,000 years was dissolved with barely a ripple. That kind of quiet suggests preparation, agreement, and manipulation on a massive scale. This brings us to the interpretation that the fall of the Merovingians was not a natural political evolution, but a carefully orchestrated cover-up. That Pepin and the Church didn't just want a new king. They wanted to erase a threat. The Merovingians, with their claims of divine blood from birth and their mystical authority, were too unruly, too independent. They didn't need the Pope to justify their rule. Their legitimacy came from their sacred origin. And if that origin was tied to Christ himself, the implications were catastrophic for the Church's entire structure of authority. The Church's power is built on a chain of spiritual succession, from the apostles to the bishops to the popes, each step sanctioned by the last. But the Merovingians represented something else entirely, a line of inheritance, a holiness passed down by blood, not by office. It was a direct contradiction to the very bones of the Catholic structure. And so the Church made a trade apostolic succession in exchange for genealogical silence, and the Carolingians were happy to oblige. Pepin's son, the great Charlemagne, would cement this new world order. His court became a center of Christian reform and imperial theology. The Bible was standardized, heresies were rooted out, and crucially, church and state were fused in a way that elevated clerical power to unprecedented heights. And woven into these reforms was a peculiar absence, the systematic downplaying of the Merovingian past. Saints once celebrated like our murdered king Dagobert II fell into obscurity. Monasteries tied to Merovingian patronage were disbanded or restructured. Their burial sites were quietly neglected. They didn't just die out, they were archived. If the Merovingians were just weak, irrelevant kings, why go to such incredible lengths to delete them from memory? The answer perhaps lies in fear. Not fear of politics, but of symbolism. Imagine a living descendant of Christ walking the halls of Europe, not claiming a throne perhaps, but still bearing the right. That right would challenge every pope, every bishop, every dogma. It would turn theology into genealogy and faith into DNA. The Carolingian coup, then, wasn't just about replacing a dynasty, it was about replacing a myth, the myth of sacred blood. But myths don't die easily. They whisper, and the whispers tell of Dagobert's son, Sigisbert, escaping to the south, his bloodline continuing, in secret diluted, but never broken, hidden among noble families, far from the centers of power. Behind every great political shift, every royal anointing, there is often a story too dangerous to tell directly. A story that must be hidden not in fire, but in forgetting. And sometimes that forgetting is just a little too perfect. But if their names were erased from the books, where did their story go? Where did it hide? Perhaps it didn't hide at all. Perhaps it was simply translated into a different language. Join me next time as we learn to read the language of symbols. Step back for a moment from the dusty chronicles and the whispered confessions. Look around you, not at the words, but at the world. On ancient coats of arms, on royal rings, in the stained glass windows of churches, and in the very folds of coronation robes, we live our lives surrounded by signs, patterns, and emblems that linger long after memory fades. And when it comes to the Merovingians, their greatest secret may not have been buried in a tomb at all, but carved, woven, and etched into the world, hidden in plain sight. The most iconic of these is the bee. Yes, the humble bee. To most of us, it's just an industrious little insect, a pleasant metaphor for hard work and order. But to the Merovingians, the bee was something far more sacred. It represented immortality, resurrection, and divine kingship. In the 17th century, the tomb of King Childeric, the father of Clovis, was unearthed, and inside, resting like tiny golden guards around his body, were over 300 exquisitely crafted golden bees. These were not mere ornaments. They were messages, a statement that this was no ordinary king, but a being of eternal rule marked by something holy. In the ancient world, the bee was often associated with the soul itself. The Egyptians believed bees carried messages between the mortal and the divine realms. The Greeks linked them to the Oracle of Delphi, where the priestesses were literally called the Melissae, the bees. That the Merovingians chose this creature as their personal symbol suggests they saw themselves not merely as rulers of land, but as sacred intermediaries in touch with something eternal. Now, trace this symbol forward through time. After the Carolingians systematically erased the Merovingians from history, the bee vanished for centuries. It lay dormant. But then in 1804, as he prepared for his coronation as Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte resurrected it. He ordered golden bees to be stitched into his imperial coronation robe. His banners bore them, his emblems swarmed with them. He deliberately bypassed the fleur-de-lis, the traditional symbol of the French kings who followed the Merovingians, and reached back consciously or not to the oldest royal line of all. Some say he did it deliberately, that he knew the story and saw himself as the rightful heir to this sacred lineage. Others believe he simply stumbled upon the bee in an archaeological report and thought it looked regal. Either way, the result was the same. The bee returned, and with it a whisper of the line it once represented. And the bees are just the beginning. Consider the fleur-de-lis, that classic emblem of France. Its origins are murky. Some trace it to the iris, others to the lotus. But there is an alternate, more esoteric reading one that ties it not to a flower, but to a lineage. The three-pronged shape has been interpreted by some as representing the Holy Family, father, mother, and child, a trinity of blood, a symbol not of piety but of a sacred birthright. In some medieval art, the fleur-de-lis is rendered in a subtly feminine way, its curves mirroring the female form, a hidden homage perhaps to Mary Magdalene. To the vessel, to the Grail, not as an object but as an origin. Merovingian coins and artifacts bore other strange sigils, seven-pointed stars representing the union of earthly and spiritual power knots without ends, and inverted crosses that later centuries would misread as signs of evil. In certain ancient abbeys with Merovingian roots, you can still find architectural anomalies. Floors laid in spiral patterns, pillars placed in precise mathematical ratios, and chapels dedicated to Mary Magdalene that predate her formal veneration by the Church by centuries. And sometimes, hidden in a fresco or in the corner of a tapestry, you'll find the bee again, tiny and almost invisible, a silent witness. If you begin to look for these symbols, not as ornaments, but as a language, you will start to find them everywhere. Not because the Merovingians planted them everywhere, but because their legacy was absorbed, repurposed, and echoed down through the centuries like a melody heard faintly in the background of 100 different songs. And this leads to a peculiar idea. What if the final trick of the Merovingians was that they never vanished at all? They adapted. Their name may have faded, their tombs hidden, their blood diluted, but their story survived, woven into glyphs, stitched into robes, and carved into archways that no one thinks to question. In a world where words are rewritten and records are redacted, symbols endure. They outlast persecution. They bypass doctrine. They sit quietly in stained glass, waiting for someone to notice. So the next time you see a bee on a crest or a fleur-de-lis above a church door, ask yourself, is it just decoration, or is it a message? The reverence for these symbols, especially those hinting at a sacred feminine principle, leads us back to the matriarch of this entire story, to the woman whose own legend took root and blossomed in the soil of France. Join me next time as we explore the enduring legend of Mary Magdalene. The wind shifts softly along the southern coast of France, carrying with it the scent of salt and wild lavender. Along the rocky shoreline of the Camargue, waves lap gently against the boats moored in the harbor of a small, unassuming village, Sainte Marie de la Mer. It's quiet here, peaceful. But if the old stories, the ones that cling to this soil like ancient vines, are to be believed, this is sacred ground. This is the place where a boat without sails, rudder, or crew once drifted ashore, bearing within it the woman who had stood at the foot of the cross, the woman whose own story was just beginning when the Gospels fell silent. Mary Magdalene. In the Christian canon, her story ends abruptly. She is present at the crucifixion. She is the first to witness the empty tomb, the first to see the risen Christ. And then, nothing. Her name vanishes from the New Testament narrative like a breath caught in the throat. There is no mention of her later travels, no record of her death, only a deafening silence from the official keepers of the faith. But tradition, especially here in France, whispers a different tale. For centuries, the people of Provence have believed that Mary Magdalene did not vanish. She fled. They say that she, along with a small group of followers, perhaps including her siblings Martha and Lazarus, escaped the persecution in the Holy Land and journeyed across the sea. Their destination was the wild coast of Gaul, a place far from Rome's immediate reach, where memory could linger unchallenged. This is a legend that has endured for over 1,000 years, long before the bloodline theory caught fire in modern conspiracy circles. Pilgrims came here to venerate her, and in the nearby town of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, a massive basilica holds what are believed to be the bones of Mary Magdalene herself. Discovered by monks in the 13th century, her skull is now encased in a golden reliquary, strands of what is said to be her long red hair still clinging to the bone. While DNA testing has never been permitted, the relics have been authenticated by the Church. If you stand in that crypt, surrounded by the hush of stone and centuries, you might feel it, a kind of tension, a truth left just barely unsaid. And then there is La Sainte-Baume, the holy cave nestled high in the Provençal mountains, a sacred pilgrimage site since at least the 5th century. This is said to be the place where Mary Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life in contemplative seclusion. Her tears, they say, hollowed the cave's walls. Her prayers sanctified the very air. It's easy to dismiss such traditions as romantic folklore, medieval inventions designed to inspire pilgrimage and boost local economies. That's certainly possible, but some details resist that easy dismissal. For instance, certain Merovingian-era chapels in southern France were dedicated to Magdalene centuries before the Church officially elevated her status. Frescoes from as early as the 6th century show her not as the penitent sinner of later church propaganda, but as a regal figure, often dressed in blue, holding a vessel, and sometimes standing beside a child. Why would these depictions predate formal doctrine by hundreds of years? This brings us to the most controversial claim at the very heart of the bloodline theory that Mary Magdalene arrived in France not alone but pregnant, that the child she carried was the direct descendant of Jesus, that the family she founded here merged into the fabric of southern French nobility quietly, reverently, and with strategic care, and that over time they became the keepers of Gnostic traditions, and perhaps even the genetic source of the Merovingian dynasty itself. Mainstream historians balk. There is no definitive proof. They say no written record. But again, the absence itself feels too neat. Why is there no tomb for her in the Holy Land? Why did the early church fathers who obsessed over the lives of saints and martyrs fall so silent on her fate? Perhaps because her story had shifted from scripture to secrecy, from gospel to blood. The Magdalene cult, as some scholars refer to it, was suppressed for centuries. The church systematically transformed her into a repentant prostitute, a narrative with no scriptural basis, but one that served to diminish her authority and erase any claim she might hold as a spiritual equal or a maternal figure. And yet she endured. She reappeared in paintings cloaked in red or green, often holding her alabaster jar. But in more esoteric works, she was shown with a book, a scroll, or a child's symbols, suggesting she carried more than just grief. She carried an inheritance. To this day, some small villages in the south of France claim Magdalene as their ancestral mother. Families tell stories, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, stories never written down, of a red-haired woman with a gentle voice of a boy, with her eyes of a legacy protected not with swords, but with silence. So, was Mary Magdalene just a disciple, a saint, a symbol of repentance? Or was she something more? A mother, a matriarch, a living grail? If so, her blood didn't end in Galilee. It flowered in the hills of France and perhaps still flows today. And if such a powerful matriarchal legacy existed, would it not have had protectors, not knights in armor, but entire communities of faith who saw the divine differently? Join me next time as we walk into the cleansing fires of the Albigensian Crusade, a war not just against heresy, but perhaps against her. Now, we descend into fire, not the flicker of candlelight in a quiet studio, or the gentle glow of a hidden truth, but the roaring, flesh-scorching kind. The kind that burns cities to the ground, silences centuries of knowledge, and turns heretics into ash. Welcome to the Albigensian Crusade, a war fought not against a kingdom or a foreign enemy, but against an idea. a war against a rumor of knowledge that refused to bow. And deep beneath the rhetoric of purity and reform lies the possibility that this was a war to exterminate the last guardians of a bloodline. The so-called heretics at the center of this firestorm were known as the Cathars. They flourished in the Languedoc region of southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries, the very same region where the legends of Mary Magdalene and the Merovingian descendants were strongest. On the surface, they were spiritual dissidents. They believed in dualism, a cosmos split between a good spiritual God and an evil material creator. To them, the physical world, including the human body, was a prison, and salvation meant escaping it. They rejected the sacraments of the church, had no priests or cathedrals, and their enlightened leaders, known as the perfects, lived lives of extreme purity and humility. To many ordinary people, they seemed more Christian than the Christians. But there was something else. There were whispers and suggestions that the Cathars held a secret knowledge, that they guarded a treasure of immense importance, that they honored Mary Magdalene not merely as a saint, but as a mother, a vessel, that they venerated not the cross of Christ's suffering, but the sacred blood of his continuation. Some believe the Cathars were the direct inheritors of Gnostic traditions smuggled into Europe centuries earlier, that they possessed ancient texts passed down from the very first followers of Magdalene herself. Their most dangerous belief may have been this, that Christ's true message had been distorted by Rome, and that his true legacy lived on, not in a church, but in blood. And then suddenly the church declared war. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade. It was unlike any campaign before it. This wasn't a holy war fought against distant infidels. It was an internal purge. Christian against Christian, French against French. Entire towns were razed from the earth. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. At the town of Béziers, when a soldier asked the papal legate how to distinguish the Cathars from the faithful Catholics, he famously declared, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Over 20,000 people died in a single day. Men, women, children, Cathars, and Catholics alike. Their only crime was living in proximity to ideas the church could not tolerate. What kind of ideas demand that kind of fire? The war raged for decades, culminating in 1244. At Montségur, the last great Cathar stronghold, a fortress perched high on a remote mountain peak. After a prolonged siege, the fortress fell. Over 200 Cathar perfects who had refused to renounce their faith were marched down the mountain and burned alive in a massive pyre. But here is the part of the story that remains a stubborn tantalizing mystery. Just days before the fortress fell, a handful of Cathars supposedly slipped away down the steep cliffs under the cover of night, carrying something with them. The chronicles never say what it was. A treasure, a gospel, a secret, something so precious it was worth risking everything for, something that could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the church. Some believe that treasure was the lost knowledge of their faith, but others believe it was something tangible, records of a sacred lineage, genealogical scrolls, perhaps even the physical evidence of that lineage. Whatever it was, the church wanted it silenced so badly that it committed what many modern historians now consider to be an act of cultural genocide. And in the ruins left behind, the silence was nearly complete, but not quite. The legends endured. Songs, symbols, and carvings in stone that no one could translate. Bees etched into hidden chapels. Grail-shaped fonts in village churches. The geography of the crusade is itself a clue. The regions targeted by the Pope's armies overlap nearly perfectly with the supposed hiding places of the Merovingian descendants. The Rhézes, the foothills of the Pyrenees, the very same places where legends placed the escape of Sigisbert IV, the murdered son of King Dagobert II. Is this all just a coincidence? Or perhaps the Cathars weren't merely spiritual rebels. Perhaps they were guardians. Think about it. A heretical sect that rejected Rome's authority, embraced the divine feminine, and operated in the very same regions where the bloodline myths flourished. A sect so dangerous it had to be eradicated with fire and steel. One compelling, if controversial, interpretation is that the Cathars were preserving and protecting the secret of the bloodline, that their belief system was not merely theological, but genealogical. Of course, no definitive proof remains. How could it, after such a violent and thorough purge, their texts were burned, their traditions obliterated? All that survived were rumors, rituals, and that same familiar silence. And yet that silence hums. You can feel it in the abbey ruins of the Languedoc, in the broken stones of Montségur, the echo of something not quite gone. So was the Albigensian Crusade just a reaction to doctrinal heresy, or was it something more? A smokescreen, a scorched earth campaign to destroy the last protectors of a secret too ancient to name, a truth that linked blood to spirit, woman to Messiah, and earth to the divine. If so, then the flames that consumed Montségur were not meant to just burn bodies. They were meant to burn a lineage. But even after the fires died down, did the secret truly vanish? Or did it simply find new guardians, new brotherhoods who operated in even deeper secrecy? Join me next time as we enter the mysterious lodges of the Freemasons. You find yourself beneath vaulted ceilings again. But this time, the air is perfumed not with ancient mildew, but with incense and old tobacco. You see velvet drapes, intricately carved oak chairs, and white aprons embroidered with symbols you only half recognize: the compass, the square, the all-seeing eye. The setting is familiar, yet elusive. This is a Masonic lodge, and once more, in the quiet of this guarded space, the whispers return. Whispers about a bloodline, about a secret too powerful for daylight. It's easy to dismiss Masonic lore as theatrical pageantry men in sashes conducting strange rituals with swords, candles, and cryptic phrases. But the Freemasons are more than a simple social club. Historically, their ranks have included scientists, kings, artists, and revolutionaries. And their symbols, well, their symbols speak louder than their words. One symbol, in particular, resurfaces a quiet link in a very long chain: the beehive. In official Masonic iconography, the beehive represents industry harmony and the collective labor of building a better world. But to anyone who has been following the trail of the Merovingians with me, it means something else entirely. As we've learned, bees were the royal emblem of the Merovingian kings, found buried with them, etched into their tombs, and revived centuries later by Napoleon Bonaparte, who some believe was trying to link himself to that same sacred bloodline through the power of symbology. So when you walk into a Masonic hall and see the beehive nestled between the all-seeing eye and the twin pillars of Solomon's temple, you start to wonder, is it a coincidence or is it continuity? The Freemasons trace their mythical origins back to the master builders of that very temple, the same temple the Knights Templar spent years excavating. In Masonic lore, their central figure is Hiram Abiff, the master architect who is martyred because he refuses to give up the secrets of his craft. He is an echo, some believe, of Christ himself. But what if this tale wasn't just an allegory for personal integrity? What if it encoded fragments of the bloodline story in metaphor and ritual, ensuring its survival, not through scripture, which can be edited and burned, but through practice, which can be passed down in secret ritual? After all, is memory wearing a costume? Masonic initiations involve symbolic death and rebirth. They feature passwords, secret handshakes, and elaborate allegories of resurrection. Some claim these rituals are not just moral lessons, but reenactments of a deeper truth, a hidden lineage kept alive through performance. In the higher degrees of the Scottish Rite, for instance, the Rose-Croix degree features a ritual death at the hands of persecutors, followed by a resurrection associated not with Christ, but with a divine king. Some versions of this ritual explicitly reject the Church's interpretation of the crucifixion. Could this be a coded veneration of a different story? One where the divine was not crucified alone but continued on through blood. Masonic texts are famously cryptic, but phrases like the lost word, the true architect, and the royal secret gain an eerie resonance when viewed through this lens. What if the lost word is not a single name, but a name line? There is historical tension here too. The Catholic Church has long and fiercely condemned Freemasonry, going so far as to excommunicate its members. Why such severe and lasting opposition? Some say it's because Freemasonry champions reason over dogma. But others argue that the real conflict lies buried deeper. That the Masons preserve the very stories the Church has spent centuries trying to erase, stories that threaten to shift spiritual authority away from Rome and place it elsewhere. Consider that many of the founding fathers of the United States, Washington, Franklin, Hancock, were Freemasons. They wove Masonic geometry into the very layout of Washington, D.C. The Capitol sits on a hill. The city is structured in star-shaped patterns, and obelisks rise like the needles of ancient pharaohs. And hidden among the official carvings, you can find them. The bees. Were these symbols just aesthetic choices, or were they the unconscious continuations of something far, far older? The most tantalizing suggestion is that some Freemasons were never meant to lead, but to hide, to obscure the truth behind layers of allegory until the world was ready. That their twin pillars do not merely mark the entrance to a symbolic temple, but to a story no longer told aloud. The scholarly community remains skeptical, of course. Most Masonic historians insist their fraternity's symbols are moral metaphors, not genealogical codes. But their arguments, while logically sound, often feel incomplete. There is a hollowness in their denial that suggests something is being left unspoken. Because if the Merovingian line survived, and if it was encoded into a cultural institution, it wouldn't be in history books. It wouldn't be shouted from pulpits. It would live in silence, in lodges, in rituals no one on the outside understands. It would live in whispers, passed down by torchlight. So ask yourself, when a Freemason refers to the great architect of the universe, is he speaking only of God, or is he speaking of a legacy? A sacred structure built not from stone but from blood. But what happens when a sacred idea is pursued? Not for enlightenment but for power. What happens when it falls into the hands of those who would twist it into an instrument of darkness? Join me next time as we confront the most disturbing chapter in this story, the Nazi obsession with the Grail. Drift with me now, far from the sleepy French villages and medieval cathedrals, into a much darker terrain. The air grows colder here. The echo is not of prayers in a quiet chapel, but of marching boots through alpine passes and into candlelit crypts. The time is the 1930s, and the shadow looming over this chapter of our story belongs to Adolf Hitler. But this isn't a story of tanks or treaties. This is about a man and a regime obsessed not just with power, but with myth, with bloodlines, ancient relics, and sacred truths twisted into a monstrous ideology. This is the story of the Third Reich's secret search for the Holy Grail and what they believed it could prove about themselves. Many know that Hitler's inner circle was fascinated by the occult, but few understand how deeply that fascination burrowed into the machinery of the Nazi state. Heinrich Himmler, the chilling architect of the SS, modeled his entire organization after a medieval knightly order, complete with strange rituals and a castle headquarters. Beneath this dark pageantry lay a singular goal to prove a mythic Aryan origin for the Germanic peoples. And that twisted quest led them straight into the shadows of the Merovingians. Himmler established an institute called the Ahnenerbe, which translates to ancestral heritage. It began as a research body, but its real purpose was far stranger. It funded expeditions across Europe and beyond, to the Pyrenees, the Black Forest, even to Tibet, hunting for artifacts, sacred sites, and ancient documents that could legitimize their racial ideology. Among their most ambitious goals was locating the real Holy Grail, which they, like the heretics before them, believed was more than just a cup. They believed it represented a bloodline, a legacy, a claim. One of their primary destinations was Rennes-le-Château. Yes, the very same village where Father Saunière had amassed his inexplicable wealth, the place where so many believed the bloodline secret had been uncovered. The Nazis scoured the area. They interviewed locals, excavated ruins, and pored over local legends. They weren't just looking for gold. They were looking for a genealogy. You see, in their corrupted view, the Merovingian kings were not just French. They were Proto-Germanic Aryan kings, noble divine, and unjustly overthrown by lesser powers. Himmler speculated that the assassination of Dagobert II had been part of a grand conspiracy, not just to destroy a dynasty, but to bury sacred, racially pure knowledge. In this twisted worldview, the holy bloodline wasn't just sacred. It was a prototype for their own ideology of a master race. They even studied the legends of the Cathars, believing that the secret treasure they guarded before being burned alive was in fact the Grail or the lineage itself. Let's pause and breathe here, because we are treading in dangerous territory. It is crucial to understand this. These beliefs appropriated and weaponized were used to justify unthinkable atrocities. The Nazis were not seeking truth. They were searching for symbols to sanctify genocide. Their obsession with blood was not about divinity. It was about supremacy. And that distinction matters more than anything. And yet, within their corrupted hunt, fragments of the original mystery resurface. There is evidence that the Ahnen Erbe uncovered manuscripts and possibly coded genealogies while exploring southern France. These documents reportedly vanished into Nazi archives, many of which were never recovered after the war. Some whisper that these lost texts contained familiar phrases, references to the Child of the Rose and the Covenant of the Bee. At Wewelsburg Castle, Himmler's intended spiritual center for the SS, a sort of dark Teutonic Camelot, the floor of the main hall featured a black sun, a strange mosaic symbol linked to cycles of death and rebirth. And one chamber, referred to unofficially as the Grail Room, was designed with perfect acoustic resonance, where it is rumored that strange rituals were conducted to channel something hidden in the blood. After the war, Allied forces confiscated hundreds of documents from Nazi vaults. Many remain classified or lost to this day. In the years that followed, reports emerged of researchers who vanished while investigating these Nazi expeditions, particularly those who were looking into the same bloodline theory we have traced. Did they find something? Or did they get too close to a secret that was still being protected? The Nazi interest in this story is a vile stain upon it, a hijacking of a sacred idea to serve an ideology of pure hatred. The Merovingian Code, if it exists, was never meant to exalt one race over another. It was a lineage of interconnection, a link between the human and the divine. It is a story that must be reclaimed from those who sought to own it and use it as a weapon. But as Europe descended into the madness of war, did the true keepers of the original secret look for an escape? Did the bloodline and its guardians once again feel the need to cross the sea? Join me next time as we follow the trail from a mysterious chapel in Scotland to the shores of the New World. Now let your thoughts drift across the Atlantic. Leave behind the bloodied cathedrals of Europe and the war-ravaged archives of the Old World. Picture a different landscape, wind-swept Scottish cliffs, giving way to dense pine forests, and then the vast and open stillness of early America. You might think the story of the Merovingians with its ancient European roots ends there. But some believe it didn't end at all. It simply crossed the sea, hidden, preserved, and quietly reborn. At the center of this transatlantic theory stands one family and one chapel soaked in mystery. The family is the Sinclairs of Rosslyn, and the chapel is Rosslyn. Built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, Rosslyn Chapel, just outside of Edinburgh, defies easy categorization. It is not purely Catholic nor comfortably Gothic. Instead, it feels like a coded message rendered in stone, a library of secrets for those who know how to read it. Look closer at its architecture, and you will see symbols from Christianity, Judaism, Norse mythology, and pagan traditions, all carved side by side. But strangest of all are the carvings of plants that shouldn't be there. Detailed depictions of maize or corn and aloe vera. But maize wasn't known in Europe until after Columbus returned from the Americas. So how could it appear carved into Scottish stone decades before his famous voyage? Here is where the story gets strange. According to Masonic lore and Sinclair family tradition, members of the Sinclair clan traveled to the New World nearly a century before Columbus. One name in particular, Henry Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney, is said to have led an expedition in 1398 to what is now Nova Scotia, Canada. Some legends claim he brought with him not just men and ships, but sacred artifacts from the dissolved Knights Templar. Was it their treasure? Was it scrolls from the Temple of Solomon? Or was it something else? Was it the secret of the bloodline seeking a new safe continent? Mainstream historians dismiss the Sinclair voyage as a romantic legend, but the story refuses to die. On Oak Island in Nova Scotia, yes, that Oak Island people have searched for centuries for a mysterious buried treasure, navigating strange tunnels, elaborate booby traps, and cryptic inscriptions. Some say it's Templar gold, but others believe it is Merovingian documentation, the proof of the bloodline carried across the sea by its Sinclair guardians and concealed under layers of secrecy and soil. The connection deepens when you examine the relationship between the Sinclairs and the Knights Templar. The family were known protectors of the Templars during their persecution in the 14th century, and Rosslyn Chapel itself is filled with Templar symbols, from the iconic red cross to the distinctive double-headed eagle. Could the Sinclairs have inherited not just Templar wealth, but their sacred knowledge, their most profound secret handed off as the order was being destroyed? One theory suggests that the Priory of Sion used families like the Sinclairs as custodians, assigning them guardianship over the bloodline's material history, while the actual descendants faded into anonymity. The chapel itself is said to have a sealed vault beneath its floor, a chamber rumored to contain priceless scrolls and relics, which despite modern technology suggesting its existence has never been officially excavated. The trail, some say, doesn't even stop in Scotland. It continues into the very foundation of the United States. In the colonial era, you can find Rosslyn-like iconography hidden in old Masonic lodges. You find curious heraldic symbols on the crests of certain founding families, bees the fleur-de-lis solar crosses, and as we've noted in Washington, D.C., a city famously laid out by Freemasons, the symbols repeat pentagrams, owls, and a hidden geometry older than the Constitution itself. George Washington himself was a high-ranking Freemason, and his inauguration took place not in a church, but within a Masonic lodge. Here lies one of the most curious ironies of our story. Could the New World, founded on ideals of revolution and democracy, have also become the secret refuge for a different kind of royalty? A royalty not of crowns and thrones, but of sacred blood hidden not to rule, but simply to endure. Modern genealogists have speculated that certain prominent East Coast families might trace a distant lineage back to the Merovingians through colonial marriages and European descent. And while statistically this may not be a bold claim, only a small subset followed the esoteric threads, the whispered stories of their own sacred origins. One researcher even claims to have found a family Bible in Virginia passed down since the 1700s that includes a quiet handwritten notation in the margins in Latin, ex sanguine regale, of the royal blood. No context, no explanation, just a quiet assertion. What began in Merovingian Gaul, bled through Templar tunnels, was whispered in Masonic rituals, may have finally crossed an ocean carried not as legend, but as legacy. If the bloodline had to flee, if the old world grew too dangerous for its truth, where else would it go? To the land of liberty, to a chapel made of stone and secrets, or to a quiet corner of Massachusetts, where a strange carving on a rock waits patiently in the weeds. But if the lineage has survived, scattered and hidden across continents and centuries, does any trace of it remain in the royal houses of Europe today? Join me next time as we look for the ghost of a Merovingian king in the polished thrones of modern monarchy. Let your gaze drift now, far from the hidden vaults and coded chapels of the past. Look instead toward the polished thrones, velvet robes, and glittering crowns of the present. Monarchies may feel like relics of a bygone era, but they persist, some ceremonial, others still wielding quiet power. Yet beneath the polished pageantry of modern royalty, beneath the televised weddings and stoic balcony waves, lies a question most would never dare to ask aloud. Could any of today's noble houses still carry the blood of Christ? This is the claim whispered in the corners of genealogical societies, dismissed by mainstream historians, but stubbornly persistent. The idea that the Merovingian line never truly died out, that it wasn't extinguished, but simply disappeared into other families, married off, obscured its sacred inheritance carefully cultivated through generations. Not just preserved, but placed. Let's begin with a verifiable fact. Many, if not most of the modern European royal families are deeply interconnected. Through centuries of strategic intermarriage, dynasties like the Habsburgs of Austria, the Bourbons of Spain and France, and the Windsors of Great Britain share common ancestry that goes back hundreds, even over 1,000 years. That much is simple historical fact. But when you trace those tangled roots deep enough into the dark soil of the early Middle Ages, some genealogists claim to find them Merovingian branches, still thriving quiet, entangled, and surprisingly close to the present. The key to this theory, the loophole in history, is the female line. Royal lineages have traditionally and obsessively tracked male descent, the passing of a name, a title, a kingdom, from father to son. But the Merovingian blood, if it truly carried the sacred DNA of Christ and Mary Magdalene, would have most likely survived through daughters, granddaughters, noble women, married off into other powerful families, their own ancient lineage slipping quietly into the record books without drawing too much attention. These women, mostly unnamed and uncelebrated in the chronicles, could have passed the bloodline forward generation after generation, until their descendants appeared centuries later with new surnames, new titles, and old blood. In fact, certain ancient family trees from southern France, from nobles with ties to the very regions once ruled by the Merovingians, show unbroken lines stretching back to the early Middle Ages. And in these genealogies, certain names repeat with an odd persistence. Dagobert, Claire, Theodoric. Are they merely homages to a forgotten past? Or are they quiet reminders of a sacred origin? The controversial book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, famously posited that certain aristocratic families in southern France were direct descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene through the Merovingians. While many of the book's claims, particularly those involving Pierre Plantard and the Priory of Sion, have been challenged or debunked, the core genealogical work has intrigued researchers for decades. Buried beneath the embellishments may lie fragments of a verifiable truth. Multiple independent genealogical studies have found that many European royals living today, especially through their shared descent from the Emperor Charlemagne, could plausibly trace their ancestry back to the early Frankish kings, including, in theory, the Merovingians whom Charlemagne's family replaced. Even Queen Elizabeth II, through her descent from Alfred the Great and her deep Germanic ties via the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, had bloodlines that looped back into the intricate web of old Europe's elite, where even the thinnest Merovingian tendril might still linger. But here is where the theory becomes more speculative, more mystical. Some believe that the very survival of monarchies, particularly in the modern age, serves as a quiet nod to this sacred legitimacy, that the symbols we see, the bees, the fleur-de-lis, the solar crosses embedded in royal crests, jewelry, and architecture, are more than just aesthetic choices. They are markers, echoes of the bloodline hidden in plain sight. In Scandinavian heraldry, you can find symbols long associated with Merovingian iconography. In Spanish royalty, the continued veneration of relics tied to Mary Magdalene persists, passed off as simple Catholic piety, but perhaps rooted in something far older. Of course, this all comes with a heaping spoonful of skepticism. Most mainstream historians agree that without definitive DNA evidence, such claims are impossible to verify. Royal genealogy is notoriously complex, a forest more tangled than readable, filled with apocryphal links, forged lineages, and assumptions based on marriage alliances rather than biological descent. But the mystery persists because it feels plausible. After all, isn't this how power truly survives? Not always through conquest, but through continuity, through names quietly carried through daughters, married into distant courts, through blood that remembers what history tries to forget. And then there are the families who never sought crowns at all, yet quietly claimed descent. In rural parts of France, Switzerland, and Italy, there are houses stone and ivy covered, whose owners are said to keep meticulous records, genealogies scrolled in Latin wrapped in cloth and stored in drawers never shown to strangers. These people don't seek power, they seek preservation, as if the bloodline once scattered chose not to rule, but simply to wait. An ongoing debate lingers. If the bloodline did survive, what would it mean? Would it grant divine authority, spiritual leadership, or would it simply be an inconvenient fact, a biological truth that challenges millennia of dogma? There is no final answer, only hints. A ring passed down, a family crest with a strange symbol, a name on an old parchment, faded but legible. But in a world of tangled records and sealed archives, how could anyone ever hope to untangle such a thread? Perhaps the key lies not in dusty books, but in the cold, clean logic of a machine. Join me next time as we enter the digital age of the hunt. Close your eyes. Now imagine a dim-lit cathedral, not of stone, but of data. Vast halls of hard drives humming with a quiet, electric urgency. Shelves of ancient texts rendered into pure code. dustless vaults that do not breathe but remember everything. We have arrived in the present, but not quite the now you know. This is the new frontier of the old mystery, the search for the Merovingian bloodline in the digital age. For centuries, researchers were constrained by geography and gatekeeping. Access to rare manuscripts required political pull, a papal blessing, or the privilege of centuries. But today, millions of documents, papal bulls, church records, noble genealogies, even esoteric manuscripts, once locked away in Vatican vaults, are being digitized. And somewhere in that tidal wave of metadata, keyword strings and cross-linked annotations may lie the code that finally breaks the silence. Artificial intelligence is already helping genealogists make connections that human researchers, with their limited lifespans and inherent biases, would have missed. An AI doesn't tire. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't dismiss what looks like a mere coincidence. It simply finds patterns. It finds names recurring across centuries, marriages that bridge forgotten dynasties, dates that align with eclipses and rituals and whispered births. The algorithms don't care about orthodoxy. They aren't interested in preserving established narratives. They just match data. And lately, they've been finding things. Take, for instance, a project launched quietly by an independent researcher in 2021. Using natural language processing on thousands of scanned church documents from the 13th and 14th centuries, they trained an AI to identify references to non-canonical figures, individuals mentioned in official records who were tied to religious centers but held no official titles. One name came up repeatedly across France, Spain, and southern England: Magdalene de Sangre. She was always female and always appeared in proximity to significant events, royal baptisms, noble weddings, and sudden convenient deaths. The name itself is suspicious. Magdalena, clearly invoking Magdalene and Sangre, a fusion of blood and the sacred. Some say it was a priest's private code. Others believe it was the pseudonym of a living custodian of the line. Either way, the pattern was clear. She appeared where the legacy needed protecting. That researcher, by the way, is no longer active online. There has also been a renewed digital excavation of the dossier's secrets, those infamous Priory of Sion documents. Most had been written off as elaborate fabrications, but by applying stylometric analysis, essentially a digital fingerprint of writing styles, some odd inconsistencies emerged. While several documents were clearly penned by Pierre Planter in the mid-20th century, at least one section displayed a writing pattern that matched no known modern author. Its syntax and archaic phrasing aligned more closely with late Renaissance Latinists, a fragment possibly predating its alleged forgers by centuries, and that fragment mentions the anointed blood in exile. The Vatican, too, has entered the digital age. Their apostolic archive, once the most secretive in the world, has begun to release select scans to the public. But for every scroll available to read, hundreds more remain sealed. AI programs have already flagged anomalous indexing patterns, rooms mislabeled, collections temporarily inaccessible, and keywords scrubbed from databases without explanation. A few particularly controversial collections, those from the early Carolingian period, are marked under review indefinitely. It's almost as if someone else is watching the watchers. This raises a provocative question. If you could train a machine to find the Merovingian line, would you? Or more to the point, has someone already done it? It would only take one powerful foundation, one group with the motive, the funding, and the algorithm, not to reveal the truth, but to hold it quietly, strategically. Because in the age of digital transparency, secrecy requires a new form of silence, invisibility in plain sight. Code written not in ink, but in absence. The true custodians of the bloodline, if they still exist, may no longer be burying scrolls in tombs or carving messages into stone. They may be embedding them in metadata, in hash signatures, in the zero-width spaces between letters, in the steganographic noise of a digital image. A photo of a rose may contain an encrypted name. A cathedral's virtual tour may contain the time-stamped echo of a grail-shaped geotag. You would never know unless you knew how to look. Which brings us full circle back to the very idea of the Grail. Not as a cup, not as a scroll, but as a signal, transmitted across time, encrypted into flesh and language, and now perhaps into silicon. We have followed this thread from ancient tombs to modern temples, from cryptic symbols to complex silicon. It's time now to step back and look again, not at the individual pieces, but at the entire impossible, deliberate story. Join me next time for our final chapter, as we ask the ultimate question: was it all a lie or the most carefully hidden truth in history? Take a breath. Let all the fragments we've gathered float in your mind. The long-haired kings and their sacred unshorn hair. The golden bees whispering of immortality. The hushed-up murder of a king named Dagobert. The parchments discovered in a dusty church pillar. The Knights Templar digging beneath Solomon's temple. The coded masterpieces of Leonardo da Vinci. The shadowy priory of Sion. The pyres of the Cathars. The sterile silence of the Vatican archives. The dark obsessions of the Nazis. The symbols carved into Scottish stone and the algorithms now sifting through the digital dust of history. We have followed this thread across 2,000 years. And after all this time, after all the speculation, the silence, and the subterfuge, the story of the Merovingian bloodline hasn't dissolved into myth. It has survived, quietly, impossibly, and it would seem deliberately. So, what do we actually know? We know the Merovingians were a line of kings who believed their right to rule came not from coronation, but from their very blood. We know they were suddenly and surgically removed from power by the Carolingian dynasty with the full blessing of the Pope in Rome. And we know that history was then systematically rewritten to portray them as weak and irrelevant. Why? We have explored the most dangerous theory of all, that their bloodline carried something the church could not tolerate or control. Not heresy in the traditional sense, but heritage, a living legacy that suggested holiness didn't reside solely in priests, bishops, or papal decrees, but could be passed down through people, through blood, through womb, through woman. Think back to Mary Magdalene, so essential to the Gospels, yet so quickly recast by the early church fathers as a reformed sinner. Her true role as Christ's companion and potential spiritual partner scrubbed from the official record. Then think of the parade of secret societies and guardians that followed, all centered around the same theme: protect a secret or suppress it. We cannot say with absolute scientific certainty that the Merovingians descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. No one alive today can. But here's what we can say. Someone somewhere believed it. They believed it enough to hide it. They believed it enough to kill for it. They believed it enough to preserve it in art symbol architecture and blood for over 1,000 years. If the story was truly nonsense, why has it never gone away? If the lineage was a lie, why would centuries of brilliant and powerful people craft such elaborate layers of protection, diversion, and disinformation? Why embed clues in cathedrals, bury maps beneath tombs, and commission paintings that show Magdalene not as a humble disciple, but as a mother, a queen, a grail bearer? Perhaps the truth has always lived in the shadows because it threatens the very structures that have defined our civilization. A divine bloodline born not from heavenly magic, but from a human union. One that says the sacred and the human were never meant to be separate, that kings can bleed and God can love. And in that simple, beautiful, heretical idea, you can hear the echo of something truly revolutionary. A church built on the rock of Peter, but forever haunted by the legacy of Mary. So, where does the bloodline live now? Is it in a sealed vault in Scotland, hiding within the endless shelves of the Vatican? Or is it walking anonymously down a crowded street, perhaps unknown even to itself, Maybe it's not about finding the final heir. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's simply about remembering that such a legacy was possible and that power, when hidden, always leaves a trail. A fleur-de-lis carved just a little too deeply. A name passed down quietly through generations. A child born to carry something more than memory. And so, here you are drifting at the edge of this great mystery. History isn't merely a collection of facts, it's memory. And memory lies easily, but it forgets with great reluctance. There is no document that proves this story beyond all doubt. And yet, what if that was always the point? Maybe this truth was never meant to be proven, only preserved. The Church has its reasons. The Templars had their vows. The Freemasons have their riddles. But you here now, you have your wonder. And wonder is the most powerful and dangerous thing of all, because it refuses to be satisfied. What matters now is that the symbols endure and the whispers continue. The light in the stained glass still flickers across Magdalene's face, and the truth, or the possibility of it, is still out there waiting to be found. So the next time you walk past an old cathedral, or stare into a painting, or feel that strange sense that something ancient is watching, maybe you'll remember. Maybe you'll look a little closer. Maybe you'll hear the code pulsing just beneath the silence. And in that silence, the line remains, waiting